kind of my most researched video that wasn't a video essay. This was kind of partially inspired by a post I saw running around on Tumblr that was talking about some like historical elements of the show and like how they kind of relate to queer history in particular. And I kind of wanted to do a deeper dive and really look into kind of more nitty-gritty things, because I know there's like moments that are kind of a little more obvious, and then there's moments that I think are not as obvious. First of all, just to be clear right off the top, yes, this is going to include spoilers. I'm going to be talking about both seasons because in order to talk about the queer historical aspect, we do have to cover both seasons in particular and kind of the queer historical elements that come up in both seasons. But it's going to focus a little bit more on season 1, I think, because season 1 has more like historical elements, whereas season 2 kind of stays a little bit more present. We do get a moment, obviously, in 1941 again, and a moment in 1873 again. So we do kind of have those moments, but for the most part, it does stay a little more grounded in the present. Oh, and obviously there's Job as well. And I think, honestly, the easiest way for me is going to be how things are presented in the show itself, rather than going in chronological order, because then I'd have to like watch them out of order and kind of figure out where the moments are. Whereas if I just watched them during the show, then I could, you know, kind of pick out which pieces were really, really important. So that's what I'm doing. There's probably going to be things that I invariably miss. So of course, down in the comments, if there is something that I missed that you really wanted me to talk about or would like me to talk about maybe in a future video, please do let me know in the comments. But until then, let's get into this. This show is so unapologetically queer. You know, yes, it's created by a cishet man. Yes, you know, a lot of the actors are cishet themselves. But I think it's important to talk about the fact that it is very much an unapologetically queer show. And I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that a lot of history and a lot of like knowledge of history has gone into this show, and especially a knowledge of queer history. I think that's so important to talk about because there are people I have heard who seem to really believe that this, you know, was all fan service, and that, you know, making Crowley and Aziraphale gay and or, you know, in love with each other and all of that is really more fan service than anything else. I tend to not believe that. And the reason I tend to not believe that is that fan service, I think, is all well and good in theory. It's all well and good as like this is how you explain why this is happening. But if you actually take the books and the show itself and you really pay attention and really break things down, there's too many elements that are too obviously well researched and very clearly included that make me believe that that's just not the case. Like, obviously, you know, if you read the book, there are so many elements that are very clearly underwritten as queer. I think Aziraphale's character is very clearly underwritten as queer. It is something that is stated in the book by name. It is said, you know, in a line. There's so many moments where people assume that they're a couple in the book. There's so many moments where people have the assumption that Aziraphale is gay. It's in all of these little things. So it's not, to me, that's not just fan service, because that's always been the case. If you want to talk fan service in a fantasy show, let's talk about fucking the ending of Supernatural and how technically the angel Castiel tells Dean how he feels and then is immediately sent to hell. Like, you know, that is a moment one could argue is more fan servicey, and it doesn't end in any way that I think is justified. I don't think it ends in a way that is enjoyable to most people. And so you end up in a situation where it's like, yeah, I guess the fans were serviced, but at what cost? Obviously, in Eden, I don't think there's necessarily anything super explicitly queer here, so we have to skip ahead a little bit. So one thing that's really, really fun, and just kind of like a random math thing that I think actually has nothing to do with like something Neil Gaiman tried to do. It was just like a really fun coincidence based on when the show came out. So if you take the show coming out as the present moment of 2019, then 11 years before, when Warlock and Adam were born, would have been 2008, I think is what I checked out the math. And then 5 years later, when Nanny Astaroth and Brother Francis come in, would have been 2013. And a fun fact about 2013 in the UK is 2013 is the year same-sex marriage was legalized in the UK. So, like, it's technically an element that's like queer history, but I think it's just a very random coincidence that just happened to really work perfectly with when the show came out and also happened to fit the original timeline of the book. So I don't think that was necessarily planned on Neil Gaiman's part. It was just a really, really fucking amazing coincidence. And then we get to episode 2, and that is where we finally meet our angels, including Sandalphon and Gabriel. Now, in the show, Aziraphale recognizes Sandalphon specifically from Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, there's a lot that can be inferred here from a biblical standpoint as far as queer history. There's not, from what I can tell, right? So I haven't read the Bible in a very long time. I did go to Catholic school. I was expected to read the Bible. I remember Sodom and Gomorrah as a story and kind of like a cautionary tale, certainly. But like, I don't remember a lot of the specifics. But I know there is the implication, since the word Sodom and the word sodomy, you know, sodomy comes from the word Sodom. So I knew that that was like kind of the implication. In the Bible, it's really just said that Sodom and Gomorrah were very wicked places. They don't really get specific into it. I did find a website that was a Bible website that very much was extremely homophobic about it and very much implied that like that was the reason, that it was just, you know, people having gay sex and that's why they had to go. When I looked later and did some research with the Encyclopedia Britannica, which I thought would be a little more, you know, cool about it, I did find that technically speaking, there's no like specific record that says that the land of Sodom is actually, that's what their wickedness was. It's not specifically said. Where people get the specific, you know, Sodom is sodomy type of thing is 2 men who were angels go into Lot's house, and there's these other men who kind of form an angry mob and say they want to know them, which again goes back to my conversation in a previous video about knowing someone in the biblical sense. So it's kind of implied that they want to have sex with these angels, and that's, I guess, part of it. But the thing is, those angels were already there because they were told that this place was bad. So like, but yeah, as far as I can tell, I mean, there's no actual proof that that's what it was, but that is the common accepted story. Sodom, which means the land of burning, by the way, and then Gomorrah, which means the land of underwater or something like that, something about water. That is kind of the common wisdom and the commonly accepted theme. So it makes perfect sense that in this story and in this context, like, this is where Aziraphale remembers this angel who is a complete and total fucking asshole, is Sodom and Gomorrah, where if it's true, you were basically killing people for being queer. And so I think it's very, very clear from the story itself that Aziraphale knows who he is. He knows who he's been for a very long time. I think he's kind of seen as like the patron saint of queer people. And so I think he probably was like, yeah, that's where I remember you, fucker. And I don't have a good memory of that time, but nothing he could do, unfortunately. So I just thought that was an interesting place, that's kind of where we meet these angels. And that's specifically where Aziraphale would remember him from. Not heaven, specifically Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, obviously, episode 3 has probably the biggest, most obvious, like, examples of, you know, queer historical moments, especially the moments in 1941, which of course we are going to get to. I'm actually going to combine just this once. I am going to combine the moment from 1941 in both season 1 and season 2 into this section, just because I feel like it all culminates together in a larger story. Rome, 41 AD. Now, what I love about this is that in the show, it's a very, very short scene. Crowley says he's nipped in for a quick temptation. And when I was researching this video, I hadn't yet seen the script book, which someone posted a picture of, that there's a deleted scene in which Crowley does specifically say everything that I was talking about in this goddamn video when I researched it myself and found out that in 41 AD, who he was probably trying to tempt was either Caligula or he was trying to tempt the people who go to assassinate Caligula. Now, we all know that ancient Rome and ancient Greece were kind of of in the same vein as far as like queer history. It was very open back then. You know, they had the Roman baths. You know, in ancient Greece, there was a lot of gay shit going on. Like that's just commonly accepted about that time frame. So I don't think I have to say why the scene in 41 AD fits this category of like queer shit. It is also interesting that aziraphale is there to influence Nero, who he wants to teach music, which of course is the famous, you know, Rome burned, Nero fiddled line. So I think that's very interesting, but there is something a little bit deeper there, right? There's that line where aziraphale says, "Let me tempt you to oysters." As we all know, oysters are considered an aphrodisiac named after Aphrodite, the goddess of love. You have to assume that aziraphale realizes what he's implying there. He's trying to tempt a demon to eat an aphrodisiac specifically. And at that point in time, I'm pretty sure that would have been, I don't know, was that something they were talking about back then? That's something I didn't actually research, is when did the term aphrodisiac come about? But like, I just think it's very interesting. And like knowing what we know now about oysters and that whole aphrodisiac idea, I guess it kind of does make sense. So then we go to the 500s with aziraphale and Crowley in Wessex in, you know, King Arthur's court. I mean, that doesn't specifically have anything for me. I didn't really have any notes, although I do know that if we really want to get into the fun nitty gritty behind the scenes and also other BBC shows, there is a BBC show called, I think it's Merlin. Sorry. It's a BBC show called Merlin, which kind of has like a subtext, not dissimilar to Good Omens, of Merlin and King Arthur, who are clearly in love. So yeah, I mean, I guess if you want to go there, that is the queer historical aspect of that scene. So at first I was like, when I wrote this note, I was like, what am I going to do with this? I have nothing really for this scene. And now I'm like, actually, let's talk about this show, because we know Doctor Who is canon in Good Omens. So it stands to reason that other why can I not say other BBC shows would also be canon in this universe? So yeah, I kind of feel like that I solved the riddle. This is so much fun. Can you tell how much fun I'm having? Then we have to go to 1601, which is of course Shakespeare. Now, I think this is another instance where there is some kind of like underlying queer historical element to it, because obviously Shakespeare was known for, that was a time when women were not allowed to be actresses. So a lot of men were playing women's roles. So naturally, anytime there was a love story, it does take on sort of a queer connotation. I think theater throughout history has kind of had a queer connotation because of things like this. So I think that adds to it. As far as I know, there has been some rumors that William Shakespeare himself might have been queer. Those are kind of unsubstantiated, same as the rumors about Jane Austen, who is kind of a big theme in season 2. But it's also very important that the line that Crowley says in this episode that William Shakespeare ends up liking is a line from Antony and Cleopatra, which is of course a, you know, kind of like a Romeo and Juliet star-crossed lovers story, which I think mirrors very well the star-crossed lovers aspect of aziraphale and Crowley themselves. There's also the moment where the name of the woman selling grapes is Juliet, which is another reference to Romeo and Juliet, so another kind of like reference to the star-crossed lovers aspect, which just kind of deeper ingrains that queer narrative throughout the show in the first place. And I really like that. I think that's a lot of fun. You know what I mean? Like this is the thing that I've come to find. The more you watch this show, there's so many layers that you don't even think about on your first watch through. It's like you watch it once, you're like, yeah, this is fun. This is cool. Then you watch it 12 more times and you're like, oh my God, there's so many things that are so much deeper in this show than even what is obvious immediately. It's so wild. And I love that. I love that so much. So next up we have 1793, which is of course the French Revolution. Now, there's nothing explicitly queer in this era. This is of course the era of Rococo. It's kind of the era where you think about, you know, the fop idea, which is a very queer, obviously, you know, aziraphale's whole outfit feels very queer coded, feels very fop coded. So next up we have, of course, 1863, which I think this is where things get really a lot more fun, right? Because the 1860s were a time in which, or I should say the 1800s, were a time in which queer life was a lot different, right? You know, there's so many historical contexts of queer authors. This was just before Oscar Wilde, who of course Aziraphale is known to be friends with. He has signed first editions from Oscar Wilde, and it's no surprise at all that he's, you know, they would be friends. Like, let's be real. So I think there's so many like queer historical moments of the 1800s. It was kind of one of those moments where it was almost a little more allowed to be queer, because even though it was like, I think late Victorian era at that point, or maybe early in Victorian era, it was very much a thing where it was like, for most of society, at least as far as I know from an American standpoint, it was like, as long as you eventually marry someone of the opposite sex, we kind of don't give a shit what you do in like your 20s and shit like that, as long as you eventually marry, you know, a man or a woman. And so that was kind of just permissive at that point in time. It was really before things started to get a lot more like, you know, no, we gotta be, you know, very straight. And I think that was probably the 1900s where that really started to take a toll, because as I understand it, for his whole trial, you know, it was kind of an open secret of everything Oscar Wilde was doing and like fucking guys and all of that. It was kind of like an open secret. But then as that whole scenario progressed and people started realizing, oh shit, I can go down for this, like Bram Stoker, who was very clearly queer, it becomes a thing where you're like, oh fuck, I have to, you know, we got to pump the brakes, we got to change this up because this is now becoming an issue. So obviously this was like 30 years before all of that happened, but it's hard to not talk about the 1800s, especially the late 1800s, as being like inherently a little more queer permissive. It is said that Aziraphale learns to dance the gavotte in a discreet gentleman's club in the 1880s, which is kind of the end of the, you know, openly queer movement. And it's very interesting that the dance that he specifically learned, I actually looked it up because I was very curious, because I knew like Discreet Gentleman's Club is obviously very queer coded. That would have been right before the whole situation with Oscar Wilde in the 1890s. So it makes perfect sense that it would still be like, yeah, it's kind of underground. I looked it up because I was curious of what the gavotte actually was. And it turns out it's considered a peasant kissing dance because at the end of the dance, you kiss your partner. And so like, if that does not tell you everything you need to know, like I was literally screaming when I read this, because I'm like, okay, so in a discreet gay club in the 1800s, an angel learns how to dance a kissing dance with other men. Like, if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about Aziraphale and who he is, like, bitch, what are we doing? How do you hear that line and not know where this is not know this has always been leading to them getting together, like, and being in love? How do you not know? Like, it's all right there. If you just paid attention, you'd see it's all right there. I almost feel like, I've never watched this show, I need someone to Photoshop me into you're gonna know exactly what I'm talking about, that meme from, I think It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where it's like he's smoking a cigarette and he's like this, and there's like red wires behind him. That's how I feel when I watch this show. It's like, we connect all the queer dots, connect them, I know they're there. Connecting dots that are like so obvious, they're not really like, no one's connecting them, bitch, like we all know. Here's where, when we get into 1941, here's where we really get into the like nitty gritty of the queer historical context, and knowing queer historical context I think makes this even more interesting. And actually, upon rewatching this scene for the millionth time, it actually adds a very sinister layer to this, because you take into consideration the elements from episode 2 or season 2 where they go back to 1941. There's this added layer wherein, there's this demon who works with Crowley, or worked with Crowley, let's say, who is trying so desperately to get on top and to, get a chance at something better for himself, that he's willing to, throw someone under the bus and use literal Nazis to out his coworker and completely destroy his life and potentially make him lose everything in order to get ahead. And it's very important that this is during this era that this takes place, that is, an era where being queer was very, very dangerous and very much could cost you, your job, your life, your family, everything. I think it started certainly during the 1800s or the 1890s. It started where the tides were turning, but definitely into World War II, things started getting a lot worse for queer people, and it became more of a thing where it became more dangerous, and being outed was a very real threat. And so it's very telling that the whole, the big plot point, especially in season 2, is that there is this demon who is trying to get proof of, Crowley working with aziraphale, basically trying to out him via taking a photo of him in a private place in order to, out him in a very literal sense. Obviously, being an angel and a demon, we can say they don't have a sex technically, and yet in the same context, because they are, opposite sides and shouldn't be working together, there's this very real thing that when you see this scene, it takes on an even more sinister undertone as a queer person watching this, who's like, shit, you are watching these two about to be outed in a very real way, and as would be the case if they were outed in real life, that could get them killed. It could get them, thrown in jail. It could get them, so many different things as humans. If you take the angel and the demon out of it and you just look at it as two men, it becomes so much more sinister, especially knowing the laws of the time. So I think that was something that was like on the, 5th and 6th rewatch, when you realize like, okay, this is what's happening here. He's trying to get ahead. And so even though ends up that aziraphale is able to protect them both and uses his prestidigitation to, I guess they call it palming, the photo and then putting something else in there so that they don't notice him, giving them something else, so it ends up saving their lives. But it's this very clear moment that like is so much deeper. And when you look specifically at like where the world was in 1941, especially in the 1940s, like queer history of that time, it just adds this extra layer. And there is an element of it that I guess one could say, the way that this character Furfur, who is like annoyed and disgusted at the fact that like Crowley doesn't remember who he is, claims that they worked together, but is like, why the fuck don't you remember me? It does almost feel as though he's also a little bit jealous of aziraphale because he gets to have Crowley. I feel like there is that element that kind of feels like it's underwritten to it, and so there's probably something like even deeper and metatextual, but it does feel like this moment that he's pissed off because we were friends, we knew each other, but you don't seem to know me, you don't even look twice at me, like why the fuck does this angel get to have all your attention? And so that's another thing, and I think there is a whole layer of people who were queer who, for their own protection, did have to throw other queer people under the bus. Well, they didn't have to, but they chose to. You think of something like when I was mentioning before Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker famously, was clearly a queer man himself, but also, threw Oscar Wilde under the bus to save his own ass. So it's like, it's the layers and layers. And I think, as queer people, there's so often times where throughout history, we've not always been the best at any time we can get a leg up. We're kind of like, well, I'm going to save my ass. I mean, there's plenty, in the 2000s, God, Perez Hilton was outing queer celebrities all the time as a queer man, knowing how dangerous that was and how much that could hurt people and hurt their careers. He did it anyway. And a lot of the people throughout history who were outing other people were often queer people themselves who were trying to distance themselves and keep themselves protected. So it is something that there's kind of like this added layer, if you think about it that way, that it's possible that Furfur was acting out of jealousy too. And I think that adds an even deeper kind of juicy layer to this. What I appreciate is that ultimately, not only is it kind of unabashedly queer, Aziraphale gets to have this moment where he gets to be a little more flamboyant and wears a boa around his neck and kind of does that affectated, higher pitched voice to really, show his enjoyment. He's getting to, be in his element. I think that's really fun. But what I also think is really fun is that at the end of the day, the message of that episode is like Crowley and Aziraphale ultimately prevailed and got to have their little romantic moment again at the bookshop, drinking wine by candlelight, So it's this moment that it's not merely, going through the motions of these like traumatic queer historical moments. It's not just the smoking gun, literally, of the, photograph of them that could get them killed, and the literal danger as well of like being discorporated from an actual gun. There's that kind of, alternating metaphor there. It's that at the end of the day, they're able to still be together and they're able to still live their life, carry on doing what they're doing, and have this little, romantic candlelight date, if you will, even after this harrowing experience. And I think that's really beautiful because it's not just like, let's go through the beats of another, queer tragedy going through history in a tragic way. It's let's show these moments and let's also show triumphs during these moments, and not just having to say, yeah, here's all the fucking historical baggage. So then we get to 1967. We're going back to season 1 for this. And this is another more overt reference rather than a covert reference, because what I have discovered, 1967 in the UK is the year that technically kind of certain aspects of gay relations were decriminalized. It's very interesting that this is also the year that's chosen of when Aziraphale decides to give Crowley the holy water, which he knows can kill him, which he knows could be dangerous, but he also decides that this is the year that I'm going to give this to you anyway. And I think one could argue that this happening during this year being the same year that, certain aspects of, same-sex relations are decriminalized could be kind of like a metaphor of sorts. It's like, okay, I'm giving this thing to you, which could ultimately harm you and which would devastate me if it did.
I've been trying to think about the holy water metaphor for like a few days now, and I never quite fully felt like I pinned it down until just now. And I was thinking about this, and I think in this particular context, it could be argued that holy water itself is a metaphor that gay sex is holy, especially since this is the year that in some contexts, gay sex became a little bit more legalized in the UK. In this context, it is kind of a way of saying, a metaphorical way of saying that it is still holy, even though it's no less dangerous during this time. By Aziraphale offering this holy thing to Crowley, being himself essentially, it takes on that deeper context in this case. So what we have is, even though the literal text of Aziraphale saying that Crowley goes too fast for him, in terms of like a romantic sense, he is still offering a piece of himself to Crowley in order to help him and protect him. And it is kind of like, this is this holy thing that ultimately is Crowley's salvation. And I think that's really beautiful.
When you say something, when you look at something like what were called sodomy laws throughout the world, there are places, including the UK, where it's like, yeah, technically 1967 was the year that part of it was decriminalized, but really it was one of those things that was still on the books up until 2013. So it technically wasn't totally decriminalized until until like 2013. And it's the same thing even here in America. There are, to this day, still sodomy laws on the books to this day in like 13 states in America. And not even just southern states, they are all over America. And actually, I just thought about something that I forgot to notate earlier back in the section of 1941. So in the section in 1941, when Furfur is trying to get Crowley in trouble, he specifically mentions that there is a infernal code that Crowley is in breach of. And of course, during this time in the UK, there were things like the sexual offenses, like the Buggery Act, which I think actually started in the 1500s, but that were very much on the books as like anti-gay laws that were very much on the books, and that would have been on the books during the 1940s. And so it's very interesting that is specifically, he mentions like this legal precedent of why what Crowley is doing with Aziraphale is wrong. So it just adds that kind of extra layer. I'm sorry I forgot about that. I was just thinking about that now. I think it's also worth noting, someone pointed out in one of my earlier videos that, one queer, aspect of the books and the show is that Aziraphale lives and works in Soho. This is kind of the, according to, people who live in the UK, it's basically the UK's version of like San Francisco. It's a very queer area. And I have to assume, considering the fact that Aziraphale has lived there since the 1800s, that was not something that he, had any problem with. It's very clear that he probably influenced it in some way, shape, or form, just by his nature of being there. Maybe the queerness sprang up around him because they just felt the good vibes, and that's why everyone sprung up there. And then of course you've got this other moment in episode 4, which is where Heaven actually learns of the, relationship of Crowley and Aziraphale throughout the years. And it's this very interesting moment because, like in the 1940s, it's all of these photos showing them together, not necessarily particularly intimate. It is something that is, maybe one could argue, innocent. That's certainly the case that, Gabriel tries to think, yeah, maybe this is innocent. But Michael is clearly someone who knows that there's more going on there. And so in season 1, it's very much this moment where I think Michael is very much that coworker who's trying to out someone to get ahead, and she is also working with someone evil in order to do that. She's working with demons in this case to try and say, hey, there's something going on. You need to look into your guy because he's doing something he's not supposed to be doing. And so there is that kind of like, also, even in 2019, it's this further, queer historical moment of like, there is something deeper than just, it's kind of a proof of like, this is still going on even in 2019. Even as far in 2019, there were still people who were losing their jobs for being queer. And yeah, technically you can't say that's the reason, but like, we know it was still happening. We know it's still happening today. There's people losing their jobs for being trans. But there is a moment in season 2, which I think really stands out. And that's the moment where the angel Muriel comes down and is dressed like a police officer, kind of in all white. And there's this kind of throwaway line in which Crowley says, are you interested in knowing about human love? I know that's like a hobby of some members of the police force. And it feels like this kind of like throwaway moment. But if we take it back to queer history, we realize that like, the people who were enforcing all of those anti-gay laws were, of course, going to be the police. You see something like Stonewall, which was a attack and a raid on queer spaces. That was happening throughout the world. It was happening in Stonewall. It was happening before Stonewall in, the Compton's cafeteria riots in San Francisco. It was happening in the UK. It was happening all over. But it's this moment of like police force getting nosy into people's businesses and love lives. And so it feels like this throwaway line from Crowley. But if we look at it in a historical context, it's so much deeper than that. It kind of, I think, goes to show the point I've been trying to make throughout this video, which is to say that nothing is, I feel as though nothing is really a throwaway line, even if it feels like a throwaway line. Everything kind of points to something deeper. Everything points to a deeper, if not philosophical meaning, a deeper, queer meaning. It's something that goes even further beyond what we see and recognize. I also think it's worth noting that in a very real sense, when you say like they could lose their jobs, Crowley does lose, there's actually something really interesting about the fact that in season 2, Crowley does lose his job and loses his apartment because of it. And so he is virtually houseless because of that. And he's living out of his car, in a very real nod and homage to something that happens to queer people every day. If these were just things by themselves, they probably wouldn't mean as much. But when you take them all together, it's very, very clear that it's just an overarching queer narrative. And so it, to me, says that this was very intentional on Neil Gaiman's part, and it speaks to how good of a writer he is. And this is kind of, again, a deeper kind of metatextual thing. It's not technically the past or the present, because it's kind of just throughout season 2. But in season 2, obviously the song from Buddy Holly, which was Every Day, which is like kind of a romance song, is playing throughout the show. And we know that Neil Gaiman originally wanted that song to be the theme song for Good Omens. In fact, in the script book, that is the song that he specifically calls out as being the theme song for the show. What's interesting is that I kind of was wondering myself, Buddy Holly is such a specific choice there, especially when Queen is kind of the referenced narrative for Crowley and his kind of love of Queen. And of course, Queen was fronted by a famously bisexual man. So what is the significance there? Well, it turns out Buddy Holly was one of the first queer allies in the 1950s, as far back as 1957, talking in press conferences about how he was pro same-sex marriage, which I think is so fascinating, and again leads to this continued meta-narrative of queerness that runs throughout the show. What are the odds that like, yes, of course, if you listen to the lyrics, it feels very like it's making a statement. Every day it's getting closer, the end of the world. Every day it's getting closer, their love. But additionally, it's this added metatextual narrative of this person who, though he was not queer himself, at least as far as I can tell, he did support the community in a very real way. And so it's very telling that that was the decided song of like, this is what should be representative of this show. And again, as I said at the top of this video, I do think there's a good chance there's going to be things that I missed. There's going to be things that I just couldn't get to for one reason or another. So if there are any historical moments that ring very queer to you that you want to talk about from this show, please comment down below. Tell me your thoughts. I would love to hear them. I'm so excited to hear everyone's thoughts about this. And, even though we've got a few years, I'm very excited to know what other queer historical moments are going to be slipped into season 3 that I'm going to have to probably make a follow-up video to this and kind of talk about those as they come up. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to subscribe, like this video. Of course, feel free to subscribe to my Patreon. That is my behind the scenes channel. Obviously, next week is going to be the 3rd installment of the Gay Omens series. I am excited about it. I'm a little bit nervous just for the sheer fact of, as I understand it, if I'm understanding Neil's foreword in the script book correctly, Crowley and Aziraphale don't really make much of an appearance in the 3rd chapter, so I feel like I'm not going to have a lot to talk about that chapter. So, I mean, if you guys have anything maybe you'd want me to talk about kind of in relation to the book, but that is also like something extended that I can talk about that isn't that chapter, because I have a feeling like there's not going to be anything queer going on without them. So I'm pretty much kind of like, I don't know what I'm going to do for this chapter, what I'm going to talk about. So if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them. And until next time, stay devilish.